All right, well, I am Danae Wolfe. I work for Ohio State University Extension as the Educational Technology Specialist for the state. So I help teach our extension staff how to integrate technology into their programming. And this encompasses really a huge variety of different things, from video production to creating infographics to using different electronic tools and mobile devices and all different sorts of things. But one of my personal areas of interest is macro photography. This is something that I've been doing since I was about really a kid. I was about 12 years old when I got interested in photography. And I've always been particularly interested in close-up and macro photography. I was really terrible at this as a young kid, but it's something that has grown with me as I've progressed in my photography over the years. Was really interested in like flower photography, botanical photography when I was young, and it wasn't until I was in college that I really started to take notice of insects and spiders. And up until that time, I hated insects and spiders. I was very scared of things like that. I don't know why, because now they seem perfectly harmless for the most part. But I really, really love macro insect photography. I love photographing insects, spiders, other arthropods, and I love teaching people how to get those same results. I have spent a lot of time and a lot of money in learning about different photography techniques. And what I've come to realize is you don't need to spend a lot of money for high quality macro photography equipment. You can employ several really fairly inexpensive macro techniques and get really, really great results. So that is sort of what we're going to be talking about today. My hope is that we'll talk for about maybe 30 to 40 minutes on 3 techniques in particular, and then we can open it up for questions and discussion. I am going to be covering 2 techniques in particular that are really geared towards folks who are using camera systems that have interchangeable lenses. So that is a digital SLR camera or a mirrorless system. These techniques are not really going to be super relevant to folks who have point and shoot cameras. We are going to cover some things about mobile macro photography though. So if you're shooting with, let's say, an iPhone or another type of camera phone, I'll share some things that you can do with that as well. So we are going to jump in and we're going to get started. The first thing I want to share, and I've sort of mentioned this before, is one of the easiest techniques to get interested in photography or to start in macro photography is to get a dedicated macro lens. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time talking about macro lenses because this isn't exactly an inexpensive macro technique. These tend to be kind of pricey. I do have a couple different macro lenses that I use. I work on a Canon platform. I have a Canon 70D, and I have the 100mm macro. I hope you guys can all see this. I can't see myself. Oh, there's myself. I have the 100mm macro lens, and then I have a much larger, let me see if I can get this out here. I have a much larger Canon 180mm macro lens, which is huge. And these lenses are not exactly cheap. I think Canon has a newer version of the 100mm macro, which is, I want to say, around $600 or $700 now. And then this 180 lens is about I paid about $1,600. That was a couple years ago. $1,600 for that lens. I also, about a year after I bought that lens, I spent about $900 on a dedicated macro flash to use with that lens. So I had $2,500 tied up in just 2 pieces of equipment. And I would go out into the field. I spent every single moment of free time I had out shooting with that equipment. And within a couple of short months, I started to suffer from some really, really bad shoulder pain. And I went to the doctor and was diagnosed with tendonitis and told, don't go out there with your camera anymore until your arm heals. My shoulder hurt so bad I couldn't even change the radio station in my car because it physically hurt just to lift my arm up. So that's when I started to look for other just less cumbersome photo techniques. But the real downside to this expensive equipment is I was not getting the results that I wanted out of that. I thought, well, if I have all this expensive equipment, my photos are going to be awesome. I'm going to be a great photographer. And that wasn't true at all. So my point in doing this webinar is to tell people that you don't need stuff like that. You can use different techniques and cheaper tools than that, and I'll be sharing a couple of those. The one thing I do want to share though is macro lenses do tend to produce pretty good results. Here are just a couple of photos that I have taken with either the 100 macro or the 180 macro. So they're very easy to use. You can throw it on your camera. You can use your camera in auto mode. You don't have to worry about using your camera in manual. You can use autofocus and all of your auto settings, and you can get really, really fantastic results. So I'll just share a couple of photos that I've taken with dedicated macro lenses. And if you happen to have a macro lens, you know probably how easy they are to use. I should probably tell you what these insects are, because I always like to include some trivia. So this one is a bottle fly, often called a filth fly, because they do tend to congregate around filth like garbage or dog poo. This is a damselfly. This last guy we saw is a dragonfly. These are two hoverflies or syrphid flies. You can see you get really, really high quality results with macro lenses, but the downside is the expense. So now I'm going to talk about two inexpensive techniques that will give you, and I like to show those photos of the macro equipment just to kind of give you a baseline for what you can expect, and then show you this reverse lens technique and then the extension tube technique, because the results are just as stunning, if not even more stunning. So the reverse lens technique I happened upon a couple of years ago in an effort to really learn how to get high magnification macro shots, because the lenses that I have, the 180 and the 100 millimeter macro, I was not getting the magnification that I wanted. And I was seeing these photographers online post these amazing photos, really, really high magnification shots. And for whatever reason, I couldn't produce that. I couldn't reproduce those. So I discovered this reverse lens technique, which sounds kind of funny if you haven't heard of it before. You basically take a lens and you mount it backwards on your camera. So I'll just show you here. This is typically the side of the lens that would be internal to your camera, but I'm actually mounting it backwards. And you do this with the help of what they call either a reversing ring or an adapter. And that allows you to mount the lens backwards. And you can get really, really high magnification shots with this. Now, you don't just want to reverse any lens. You tend to want to use a prime lens. And a prime lens is a lens that's not zoom. It's a fixed focal length lens. The wider the angle, the more magnification that you're going to get. So notice here I have on the slide either a 28 millimeter or a 50 millimeter. Those prime lenses tend to work really well. I am using a 28 millimeter lens that was produced in the 1970s. I think it was manufactured in 73 or 74. It's an old Canon lens. And the reason why I'm using such an old lens is because you have a manual aperture ring, meaning that I can manually open and close my aperture. The reason why this is so important is because when you mount the lens backwards on your camera, you lose electrical connectivity between the camera and the lens. So what that means is you are not going to be able to change the aperture from your camera, which is how you would typically change the aperture on your lens. You also do not have autofocus. Again, you have no connectivity. Your camera cannot communicate with that lens at all. So most modern lenses do not have a manual aperture ring, which is why the recommendation tends to be get one of these old lenses and use that, because then you can open and close your aperture. And aperture dictates your depth of field. And depth of field is one of the most important things in macro photography. If your depth of field is really, really shallow or really, really narrow, you're not going to get enough of, whether you're photographing a flower or an insect, you're not going to get enough of that in focus to produce a really good shot. So aperture is key. So you want a prime lens, preferably something that's a wider angle, like 28 millimeter or 50 millimeter. You do need that special adapter, and the adapter that you choose is going to be dependent on the lens that you're using, the filter thread size of the lens that you're using specifically. I'll take my adapter off here so you can just see what it looks like. Just a little metal ring. It's completely hollow. And this screws onto the filter threads of that lens. So this particular lens is a 55 millimeter filter thread. So I needed a 55 millimeter thread on one side of my adapter. And on the other side of my adapter is my camera's lens mount type. So I have a Canon 70D with an EF mount. So this is an EF mount to a 55 millimeter thread. You can find these adapters online, eBay, Amazon, B&H Photo, they all sell them. And I think this one was probably $4 or $5. So they're not very expensive. The lens I got on eBay for, I think I paid around $35 for the lens. If you were a photographer in the film days, or you have a family or friend who was a photographer in the film days, you may have a lens laying around that you can use. And then you would just need to buy your adapter. The results are really amazing. So I'm going to show you some photos that I've taken with this technique. One of the things that I will mention, and this is one of the biggest downsides of using this technique, is I have to be very, very physically close to the subject that I'm photographing in order to get it in focus, sometimes just a couple of inches away. So if I was this far away, I wouldn't be able to photograph whatever it is I'm trying to photograph, but I have to be really, really close, which for an insect like a lady beetle, in this case, that's not so scary. But if you're photographing something like a wasp or a bee, which happen to be two of my personal favorite subjects to photograph, sometimes that can get a little bit dangerous, especially if you're not really familiar with insect behavior. The other thing I will mention is lighting tends to be an issue. And I like to put this into perspective by telling people, if you are a landscape photographer, let's say you're at the Grand Canyon and you're taking a landscape photo of the entire view of the Grand Canyon, you have light hitting the entire landscape and bouncing back off of that landscape. It could be from the sky, the clouds, the Grand Canyon itself, trees, anything else in that shot. It's going to be bouncing back into your camera. So you may have several hundred square miles worth of surfaces that is bouncing light back into your camera. When you're taking a macro photo, all of a sudden you're narrowing into a very, very tiny little portion of the environment. So you don't have that much light. So lighting tends to always be problematic with macro photography. I have a camera with a built-in flash, and if you know anything about photography, or if you've employed photography, portrait photography, even just like taking candid shots of your family, you might know that the built-in flash tends to be kind of useless. It tends to produce really, really bad lighting. If you're photographing people, especially indoors, portraits, you just tend to get some bad shadows and glare. For whatever reason, the pop-up flash is like magical when it comes to macro photography and this reverse lens technique. It works really, really well to provide just the right amount of lighting. With this setup, with the 28mm lens on my camera, the pop-up flash is all I need. Now you will see in the center of this photograph of this lady beetle, there is a hot spot. That hot spot was produced by my flash. Because it's a shiny surface, that light was reflecting back on it and producing that hot spot. So you can get something like this, which is just a diffuser. This looks kind of big and cool, and I always get stopped when I'm in the field. People always ask me, what is that cool flash that you're using? It's literally just a big piece of plastic that goes over my built-in flash, and it just helps to diffuse the light coming off of here. So I wouldn't get as bright of a hot spot had I been using this diffuser. And I think this diffuser, this is called a Graslin Spark, and I'd be happy to provide more information for this. This, I think, was about $40 or $50, which is kind of absurdly expensive for what it is. It tends to work really well. It mounts right into my camera's hot shoe mount. So it goes right on top. My flash pops up inside of it. It works really well. You can build a DIY flash diffuser for pennies. You can use, I've seen people use coat hangers and the wire, they'll like create a mount that goes into their hot shoe mount. I've seen people use paper towels and cereal boxes or toilet paper tubes, pieces of cardboard. Basically, all you want to do is diffuse that light, and paper towels tend to work remarkably well. So you can do that as well. So a couple other examples of photos that I've taken with this technique. This is a paper wasp. Again, you'll see that sort of hot spots in the wasp's eyes right here where the flash went off. If you didn't know I used a flash, you might not even notice that. That might not even bother you. Again, because this is a wasp, and because wasps and some bees tend to sting and be scary, if you're facing, let's say, a bald-faced hornet or something like that, it can be kind of scary to be that physically close to that subject. I tend to want to photograph insects like this when it's a little bit cooler. Actually, October tends to be a really great month for macro insect photography because it's a little bit cooler. The insects aren't moving around as much. If it's a nice chilly day with kind of a light breeze, those insects might be a little stationary. So you can find them hanging out on plants trying to protect themselves from the wind. It's a great time to photograph them. Here's a little green sweat bee. Again, you get that hot spot right in the eye. The eye is a little bit shiny. This is an ambush bug. Sometimes you have to search a little bit hard to find these insects. They tend to be really good at camouflage. And I always tell people, sometimes it's not just about learning how to photograph, learning the techniques involved in macro photography. Sometimes it's about learning to see the environment so that you're seeing some of these things in the environment. This is a tiny little crab spider. And this crab spider, so small you wouldn't have even ever noticed it unless you were really, really looking for it. But you get that great magnification with this reverse lens technique. Another sweat bee. And here's just a small aster. Now, one thing that I will also mention here, another con to this technique, is you do not have infinity focus. You have a very, very narrow plane of focus. So if I were out in my backyard and I'm photographing, let's say, insects or flowers, and my son is starting to do something really cool or really cute, and I want to photograph him, I'm not just going to be able to switch focus and say, okay, now I'm going to photograph my son, because you don't have that infinity focus. I would have to actually remove this lens and put a different lens on my camera for that. So I only have a plane of focus within a couple of very, very small millimeters, actually. This can also be a downside, because one time I was out in the field and I saw a really awesome praying mantis, and I really wanted to photograph this whole praying mantis, but the only lens I had with me was the reverse lens. So I could only get a very, very close-up portrait shot of that praying mantis's face. And because the depth of field was so narrow, and because a praying mantis, it has such a wide plane, I guess, I wasn't able to get a really good shot of that praying mantis. So that was sort of disappointing. So there are pros and cons, but one of the biggest pros is this setup cost me less than $50. And you can see some of the examples of the shots that you can get. So it's a really, really great thing to try out. It does take some patience. It does take some experience. I always tell people, if you're going to try this technique out, try it more than once. The first time I tried it, I absolutely hated it. And I shelved it for about a year. And then I mentioned it in one of my photo workshops that I did, and people started to ask me a lot of questions about it. So I thought, well, maybe I should revisit this and learn how to use it, because some people have really, really great success. And that's when I fell in love with it. And I started using it almost exclusively for all of my macro work for a couple years. And then I discovered something new, which isn't new, but it was newer to me, I should say. And that is the use of extension tubes. Extension tubes have been around for a long time. I had gotten extension tubes a couple years ago for Christmas and tried to use them a couple times. Again, I really didn't like the technique very much, so I didn't really stick with it. But the great thing about this technique is it can also be fairly inexpensive, depending on your budget. And I think it's a lot easier to use than the reverse lens technique, to be honest. So what extension tubes do is they decrease the minimal focal distance between the minimal focal distance for your lens. So a good way to put this is, let's say my 100 millimeter macro lens, I can't remember the exact minimal focal distance, but I want to say it's around 10 inches, 10 or 12 inches, meaning I have to be at least about a foot away from my subject in order to get that subject into focus. Now, if I put extension tubes, and these mount between my camera and the lens, if I put a set of extension tubes on, I may decrease that minimal focal distance from 10 inches to maybe 7 or 8 inches. So now I can get just a little bit closer to my subject, which in turn magnifies it. So it's a really great thing to use. They vary in price. I have a set of 2 Canon extension tubes. The Canon tubes in particular are sold independently of one another. So I have a 12 millimeter tube, and I have a 25 millimeter tube. These are completely hollow. There are no optical elements in an extension tube. So you don't want to pay a lot of money for them. The Canon tubes are a little bit pricier. Like I said, I got them for Christmas. I probably wouldn't have splurged on the Canon tubes if I had been buying them for myself. But because there are no optical elements, they don't reduce the amount of light coming into your camera. So you don't have to worry about, sometimes if you're using like a 2x multiplier on your camera, or if you're using some of just the magnifying filters, every piece of glass that you put on your lens is going to reduce the amount of light that can come into your lens. So that's going to be a little bit problematic. These extension tubes do not do that. I think this 25 millimeter Canon tube, I want to say is around 130, maybe 120. And then the 12 millimeter tube, I think is around 70 or 80. you can find sets of tubes that come with a 10 millimeter tube, a 24 millimeter tube, and I think a 36 millimeter tube, all three of those. You can find them from Kenko, it's Kenko is the brand name. You can also find them from ProMaster and a variety of other less expensive brands. And they come with more than just the 12 and 25. You're going to get more options. You can use them independently or you can stack them. Just depends on what you need. Now the real cool thing is I use my extension tubes with a 24 millimeter, what they call a pancake lens. The reason why this is called a pancake lens is because it is so narrow. It has such a narrow little profile. This is a Canon lens. I paid about $150 for this, which is relatively inexpensive. You can also use a nifty 50. A lot of people call them the nifty 50 lens. If you have a 50 millimeter, you could use a zoom lens with this. So if you have, let's say, a kit lens that came standard with your camera, like a 17 to 85 or 18 to 55 lens, you could use extension tubes with that as well. I tend to get really, really good results. If you want high magnification, you're probably going to want to use a nice wide angle lens, like a 24 millimeter or 50 millimeter. I'll show you some results in just a second, but before I do that, I'll tell you a story. I had the opportunity to travel to Costa Rica in April for a leadership development program offered through Extension. And prior to going on that trip, I was so excited about the idea that I was going to be going to Costa Rica, where there were going to be a tremendous diversity of insects and spiders to photograph. So I had planned on taking like all my macro equipment. I was going to do a reverse lens. I was going to do my big 180 and my 100 macro. I was going to do my macro flash. I had all this like planned out that I was going to take. And in the days leading up to leaving for that trip, I thought, what am I doing? Like, I'm going on this trip for leadership development, not for like some insect photography safari thing. So I sort of knocked some sense into myself, and I decided I would take the bare minimum that I could possibly get away with. So I wanted a lens that would be a great all-purpose lens that I could do group shots with, I could do landscapes with, I could do whatever with. That was my 24 millimeter lens. It's small. If something were to happen to it, it's not a hugely expensive lens. It was only about $150, which is still pricey, but it's not as expensive as other lenses. So that's a great all-purpose lens. And I took one extension tube. I took my 12 millimeter extension tube because that gave me my macro capability. And I thought, I'm going to come home and I'm either going to be really, really disappointed in myself, or I'm going to come home and this is going to be like the awesomest technique I've ever discovered, because it's such a minimal amount of equipment. And I didn't have to lug all of this heavy camera equipment with me while I was, in the farm fields and rainforest really of Costa Rica. So I ended up getting really, really amazing results. Before I show you these results, because this is not a cool insect from Costa Rica, these are some shots that I photographed in my office a couple years ago. I was trying to really compare what I could produce with the extension tubes. So this was just happened to be in my office. It's a thing of sugar. And that was taken with a 50 millimeter lens that I had on my camera. So to compare, I zoomed in it as far as I could. I got as close as I possibly could to this can of sugar with no extension tube with my 50 millimeter lens. And this is what I could come up with. It's fairly decent. If I was taking a photo of, let's say, a praying mantis, something very large, that wouldn't be a bad result. But if I wanted to photograph, let's say, a small ant or a very small spider, that wouldn't be close enough. So I decided to put my 25 millimeter extension tube on that 50 millimeter lens. And now this is how much closer I can get. Now notice how the center of the photo is in focus, like the star sort of going right down the center, because this is a round can. You're going to start to lose focus as that can gets further and further away from the lens because it's rounded. Hope that makes sense. This next photo is out of focus, unfortunately, but it's just to show you the 50 millimeter lens with both the 25 millimeter extension tube and the 12 millimeter extension tube combined. So we go from no extension tube all the way to, let's say that would have been what, 37 millimeters worth of extension tubes with both of those combined. So in practice, when you start to go out into the field and shoot insects, again, this was with a 24 millimeter lens and a 12 millimeter extension tube. This is I think it's called a monkey grasshopper. might be wrong on that though. The results were really stunning. And the reason why they're so stunning is, as I mentioned, this whole setup is very, very lightweight. It's got a very narrow profile. It's great for traveling. And I could quickly take the extension tube off of my camera setup, and I would have a great all-purpose shooting. So I could go out and shoot these insects. I could quickly take the extension tube off of my camera, and I would have a great setup for group shots. So this is a little leaf hopper. This is, not sure what this is. I think it's some kind of leaf beetle. Again, I was using the pop-up flash for this technique, and I was also using my flash diffuser. So if I had not been using the flash diffuser, you'd probably get some more hot spots on those insects than you see in the photos. Here's a snail on the backside of some kind of palm leaf. And then here are some shots that I took in my own backyard. When I got home from Costa Rica, I was just infatuated with this technique. So I started to really try and learn a little bit more about it, and took some really cool shots in my own yard. Now this shot was with the 25 millimeter extension tube paired with a 24 millimeter lens. So this gets me a little bit more magnification. I think this was also with the 25 millimeter tube. The more tubes that you have, or the higher number, so if you were using like a 36 millimeter extension tube, you would just continue to magnify those shots. You would, and that's the wrong way of saying it. You don't magnify the shot, you're able to get physically closer to your subject, which in turn magnifies it. So that is the extension tube technique. And again, it's relatively inexpensive. You may already have a prime lens, like a nifty 50 laying around. You can purchase those lenses for, I know for like DSLR setups, you can get them, I think as cheap as like $100, $120, maybe even cheaper, especially if you buy them secondhand. And then the tubes, I know ProMaster and Kenko, I mentioned, both make a set. I want to say one of those sets was around $100. The other set, I think, was just slightly more than that. You can buy those from Amazon, B&H, eBay, any of those sources, and those are new prices too. So you get a brand new set. The one thing that you do want to focus on is you want to get extension tubes that retain electrical connectivity. If you go on like Amazon and you search for extension tubes, you may find sets for like $10. Those sets do not retain electrical connectivity between your camera and your lens. So if that's the case, you will lose autofocus, which I tend to not use autofocus with macro photography anyway. I find it very cumbersome. But you will lose autofocus and you will not be able to change your aperture. So those are things that you want to keep in mind. I started out with a set of extension tubes that did not have electrical connectivity. And I knew that when I bought them, I just wanted to see how they worked. They were so flimsy and so cumbersome, and I really, really hated this technique for a long time. And then I got my better Canon tubes and I just fell in love with it. So keep that in mind as well. And I will stop here just for a minute. And Mark, do we have any questions coming through?
No, there are not any right now. So we'd encourage folks, if you have questions, feel free to ask those. I put a link to I took the freedom to put a link to your website in the chat. So
thank you.
I hope you don't mind. And
no, not at all.
I think I also saw a Facebook page there too. So I think if people search Wolfe Macro Photography, they'll find you.
Yeah, I have a Facebook page where I post some of my photos. I tend to be most active on that page. I also have a blog at chasingbugs.com, and the Chasing Bugs blog, I'm not super active, but when I have a new photo technique or when I have something that I want to share, I usually try and use that blog for that information. I did write an article a couple years ago on the reverse lens macro technique, and it was republished on Petapixel, and it got quite a bit of attention. But if you need a resource page to look at, you can always go back to that. You can always go back to that article, and it kind of gives a nice little overview of the reverse lens technique.
Okay. Do you see that? Did you see the question in Q&A there? Okay.
Yes. Do I protect the reversed 28 millimeter exposed lens backside with a clear filter? I do not. I do not have a filter on that. And the reason is usually people, like any camera store, any like professional photographer will typically tell you have at least a UV filter on any lens that you're using. The reason why I don't do it in this case is because, again, every time you add an additional glass element, you might lose a little bit of light coming into your camera. But generally too, because this is an old lens, if something were to happen to it, if it got broke, if I dropped it and the glass broke, I wouldn't be too sad about it. I would just try and find a new one. So no, I do not protect that. And some people might also worry too. If you search the reverse lens technique, you might find a lot of people who say, well, just use one of your current lenses. Like if you have a current like 50 millimeter lens, you can just reverse that and use it. But you are exposing the innards of your lens to the elements because it's now on the outside of your camera. So it's another reason why to get sort of an old lens that if something happens to it, you might not care so much. You don't want to invest too much money in one of these old lenses. I mean, you may, but generally I would say try and find one from a friend or from a family member, a garage sale, something like that. All right, any other questions?
There's a question there in chat if you want to look there from Jim.
Thoughts on taking pictures through a microscope eyepiece, but off topic. So Jim, I have never used my DSLR to take pictures through a microscope eyepiece. There are, and in fact, when I was a county educator in Ag and Natural Resources and I was doing a lot of insect identification for people, I always tried to, I always looked up methods that would allow me to like actually hook up my SLR in a more official way to the microscope to see if I could make that happen. And I never invested the money in it because I didn't think that it was worth it, because I can take good macro enough, I should say, shots that would allow me to identify those insects. What I did do occasionally, however, and this wasn't the best way of doing this, but I would sometimes hold my phone camera up to the microscope. You have to get it just right in order to actually get the shot of it. But I remember one time somebody brought in a bed bug, and I couldn't tell if it was a bat bug or a bed bug. And I was able to take a good enough photo with my phone camera through the microscope eyepiece to send that to somebody who could identify it for me. So I don't know if that really helps answer your question in any great depth. There are systems in place, and there are microscopes that you can buy that actually have like DSLR adapters or attachments that allow you to actually hook up your camera. I know I've also seen people like 3D print some adapters that allow them to hook that up too, and they manufacture their own. So Jim said he has a setup. It's a little bit cumbersome. Yeah, so the iPhone technique, it doesn't work that great. It usually got me to what I needed, but yeah, it's not the easiest technique to use. And I have no experience doing anything with like a sophisticated setup like you described, but I would love to see what you have, and maybe at some point I can come out your way and you can teach me how to use that. We can do some workshops on that or something. I would love to learn more. So any other questions? I want to cover just a couple more quick things. Really, I just want to talk a little bit about cell phone photography and my experience with macro cell phone photography. I'm not seeing any other questions come through. So like I said, I have been doing DSLR photography for quite some time now, for really over half my life. So I've always wanted something that I could just throw in like my camera bag or in my purse and have just in case I did not have my big camera, but like I found a really cool bug that I wanted to photograph, and the only thing I had was my camera phone. So I discovered a couple things. The first thing is that you can use a variety of different little plastic lenses that you might be able to break out of, let's say, an old point and shoot camera or an old disposable camera, is what I'm trying to say. You can break out one of the lenses of like an old disposable camera and just literally hold it in front of the lens of your cell phone camera, and that gets you some pretty cool magnification. Here's an example of how I did this. So on the left, you see an image of a flower. This is as close as my phone, and this is with an iPhone. This is as close as my phone would focus on that flower with no special adapter or lenses. And then I broke a lens out of an old disposable camera. I just held it in front of my lens on my camera, and I was able to get that kind of magnification. And that's that's free. You know, you can find old disposable cameras. You might even be able to go to some place that does film developing for disposable cameras, maybe like a Walgreens or a Walmart, and ask them if they have one. I know I don't see a lot of people using disposable cameras anymore, but people still use them. So you might be able to find one and then just break that lens out and hold it in front of your phone. Now, the problem with that is it is kind of cumbersome because it does take both hands. You have to hold your phone with one hand and you have to hold the lens with another. So there are some things that you can purchase. I've seen some as cheap as $5 or $10. I've seen the really cool rubber band one that rubber bands around the outside of your phone, and then it has a little lens in it that just sits over top of your lens. That's great because it's somewhat hands-free. You just have to hold your camera, but you don't have to hold the lens. The other thing that you can do is there are some more expensive things that you can buy. I invested about $80 in this OSUE clip earlier this year, and this is a 4-in-1. This is a 4-in-1 adapter for your camera phone, and they make them for a variety of the most popular phones. This comes with a wide-angle lens and a fisheye lens. Those are the two lenses that you can screw on and off. And then if I unscrew that lens, what's automatically in here built into the clip is a macro lens. And I have a 10x macro and a 15x macro. And this just slips right over top of my camera phone. And it's really nice because it is hands-free. So now I have 4-in-1 lenses, including 2 great macro lenses. And here's an example of a photo that I took with the macro lens. I honestly can't remember if this was with a 10x or a 15x, but it was with one of the 2 macro lenses on this clip. This is a B. You can see I got some pretty good detail in the B on the backside and then on the pollen basket here. It's pretty good detail for what it is. I don't know if it's worth $80 though, because I can get fairly good detail with just a broken lens out of a disposable camera as well. Here's another example of that same flower with this OSUE clip. So one of the things I don't like about the design of the OSUE clip, and this is for the iPhone specifically, is on the front of your phone, you have a little light sensor that senses the ambient light in the room. And I have my phone set to auto brightness. So if I'm in a really, really dark room, my phone screen will dim because it thinks there's plenty of light on the phone screen coming up, but I can see it in a dim room. If I'm in really, really bright sunlight, the screen is going to get brighter so I can see it better. This OSUE clip very inconveniently covers that light sensor. So if I'm in bright sunlight trying to photograph something, then my phone thinks, because that light sensor is covered, my phone thinks I'm in a really dark room. So I do have to shut off the auto brightness or override that auto brightness setting on my phone, which is just for $80. I feel like that shouldn't be a design flaw. But again, that's just a personal opinion. It is a great little tool just to have with you. And you can throw it in your purse, and if you do happen to stumble upon something in the field and you need that macro capability, you just throw it on your phone. The other great thing is this 4-in-1. It does offer a really great fisheye and wide-angle lens as well. And it's great for interior photography. It's great if you're into taking selfies, you want to throw your phone on a selfie stick and put that wide-angle lens on. You can get a nice group shot because you're going to have that wider angle. So it is a nice little versatile clip, but it is a little pricey. You can find stuff with this. You can find similar things like this on eBay or Amazon for $5 or $10. The OSUE clip is one of the more well-known name brands, but I had a master gardener that I used to work with who she bought something on eBay for $5, and it was similar to this, just clipped over your phone, and it worked brilliantly for taking macro shots with a phone. The other downside to this clip in particular is you cannot use it with a case on your phone. So I have to take the case off of my phone, which I find inconvenient. You can buy OSUE clip phone cases though that allow you to actually put this on your phone. There's a case specifically designed, but then that's more money that you're paying for that. So those are the 3 techniques that I wanted to share for the purpose of the webinar. I do have just a couple other things that I wanted to show you. I have a couple other tips and tricks for things that that you can do to get great macro shots, regardless of whether you're shooting with a DSLR or a mirrorless or a phone camera. So I'll go through some of those techniques. It'll only take me a few more minutes, and then we can open it up for more questions and discussion. And I do see somebody posted, broken lens with sticky back Velcro may work too. Yeah, you could do Velcro, you could even do like tape if you really wanted to. There are so many different tutorials online for how you can create different macro lenses for your camera. So definitely check some of those out too, because you don't have to spend a lot of money to get really great results. And hopefully I've made that case as we've gone through the webinar here today. Can I spell the name of the clip for the iPhone? Yeah, so this is called the Ollo clip, and I'll just type it in here for everybody. It's OLLO clip. And like I said, if you go to their website, they have all different sorts of, you don't have to get a foreign one. I think they have one that's just macro lenses, which is probably less expensive. And they have them for all different phone types too. So you want to make sure that you're purchasing the one specifically for your phone. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the creative aspect of macro photography. And I'm just going to cover some of these things: composition, lighting, depth of field, background, color, and then subject matter. So we tend to focus a lot on rules when we talk about photography. You've probably heard people mention things like the rule of thirds, which just means that you're basically breaking your photograph, compositionally speaking, into a tic-tac-toe like game field chart, whatever you want to call it. You're breaking it into 9 squares, and you want to place your areas of focus either sort of in one of those quadrants, or you want to place them where those lines intersect. So you can see those yellow circles are where those lines would intersect. I tend to tell people, don't get caught up in things like this. Yes, it can make for a more interesting composition, but that is not a hard, fast rule. So do what feels right to you. So I'm going to show you some examples of photos that do use the rule of thirds and photos that might not. Here you'll see the grasshopper is placed on the far right, sort of on that far right side. And then you have just a sort of a clearer background. One of the biggest things, and I will talk about background in a second, but one of the biggest things with macro photography is you want clear backgrounds if you're going for a more artistic approach. Because if you have a lot of leaves or a lot of debris, flowers, pieces of grass or things like that, it can distract from the main focus of your photograph. Now, if you are doing more natural history photography or photography for identification purposes, or like if you want to take photos for a fact sheet and you want to show this grasshopper, but you also want to show your audience sort of the environment in which that grasshopper lives, it might make sense to have stuff in that background. Your depth of field might not be so narrow because you want to show a little bit more about the natural history of that species. So just something else to keep in mind. You'll notice here these bees on this sunflower, I tried to place them at those 2 intersecting points to create a more interesting composition in terms of the rule of third. Sometimes we tell folks, don't put anything directly in the middle, like the very center of your photograph, because that doesn't follow the rule of thirds. I do stuff in the center of my photographs all the time. So it just do what feels right for you and whatever it is that you're photographing. Lighting is also very, very important for macro photography and really any type of photography, because all photography is you capturing light on a light sensitive material, whether it's film or whether it's a light sensitive sensor in a digital camera. All photography is light. So you really have to keep that in mind. Now this is an example of flash fall off. And unless you're really using a macro flash, you probably don't have to be too concerned by this. But you'll see that there's a water lily. Sunlight is hitting the water lily. I took this in a botanical garden. And the background is completely black. That is not artificially made in Photoshop. That background was actually black in camera. The reason for that is because I was using a macro flash. The flash output was strong enough to hit the flower, but it was not strong enough to hit whatever was in the background of that flower, which was quite a bit far behind that flower. I don't know if that makes sense. But in other words, the flash diffused enough before it hit the background that it was able to bounce back into my camera and illuminate the flower, but it didn't illuminate anything behind the flower. There was a bunch of stuff behind the flower, probably people walking around and other stuff, but I was able to kind of get rid of that with that flash fall off. So it gives it a really cool effect. There's another example of that flash fall off. This is a long-legged fly. It looks like he's eating something. Behind this fly, maybe about 10 or 15 feet behind this fly, was my ugly yellow garage. You don't see that because that flash was strong enough to illuminate the insect, but not the garage behind it. So it gives it kind of a neat effect, almost like a painting. One of my favorite times of day to go out shooting is in the early morning. when insects are still kind of in that stasis. They're not moving around a whole lot because they're still a little bit cold. They might be waiting for the sun to come up and warm them up. Plus you get some really, really cool dewdrops, and you get some really harsh shadows. A lot of people say don't go out like when you have really, really harsh sunlight because you get some harsh shadows. And this is an example of using those shadows to your benefit. This is a grasshopper taken behind a nice thick blade of grass, so you just get the shadow there. I mentioned before that depth of field is also really, really important. Depth of field basically dictates how much of a plane of focus you're going to have in your photo. This is a honeybee, and I had enough depth of field to really get that nice plane of focus on the eye. You get a little bit of the antennae here, but as the antennae gets closer to you, you'll notice it falls out of focus. The antennae in the back, as this one falls away from you, it falls out of focus. But you can get all these little hairs on the legs, but you don't get a tremendous depth of focus. The background is all rendered out of focus, which is kind of nice because it sets that bee away from whatever it was in the background. Here's an example of a jumping spider where I wish I had greater depth of field. If these front legs had been in focus, it would have made for a much better photograph in my opinion, but the depth of field was so limited that I was really only able to get some of these hairs on the head and parts of the eyes in focus. So again, depth of field really important. I mentioned before that backgrounds are very, very important as well. If you're doing more artistic macro photography, you want to try and set those subjects as far apart as possible from their background, so it doesn't distract from whatever it is you're photographing. This is a dragonfly, and I was able to set it far enough apart from the grass in the background that all you see is this nice, crisp, clear green background. There's not a lot of distracting elements there. Here's an example of a caterpillar that I took from a very, very low angle up towards the sky. So all you see is that blue. It provides a kind of a nice contrast to the black and yellow of the caterpillar as well. And then color, I already showed this photo. This is one of my favorite photos because it's such a common fly, and a lot of people hate these types of flies, again, because they're called filth flies. They tend to hang out around filth. But you have the contrasting of the eye of that bottle fly, the nice red top of color, contrasted with that pink border of, I don't know what kind of leaf it was a weed in my yard, but that beautiful pink border of that leaf. So it just provides some nice contrast. Again, yellow and purple, great colors for insects and flowers. The nice green of this buffalo tree hopper matched on, I think this was on a bean plant, or I think it was a bean plant in my raised bed. And the background is also green. So it sort of shows you how that insect can be greatly camouflaged in your garden. And then here's an example of a mayfly that I took up on the shores of Lake Erie up here in the Cleveland area. And it was reflected on a glass door. So kind of a neat shot, nice color. The color of the door sort of matches the color in the wing a little bit. So playing with color is very helpful as well. I think that is the last slide I have, and we're doing pretty well on time. So I do have my contact information up here. My email address is wolf.540@osu.edu. Feel free to email me any questions that you might have. I do offer more in-depth macro photography workshops that I've done here in Ohio. I've done half-day workshops. I've done 2-day workshops as well, a lot of times with Master Gardener programs. I love doing that. I love teaching people about macro photography. And if you have questions about anything I've gone over today, you can feel free to email me at that email address.
Danae, do you do any, you sort of alluded to it real quick, but it sounds like you don't, but you say you don't do any Photoshop, or have you ever experimented with using Photoshop to get different effects, or to either with lighting or those kind of things?
Yeah, so I do post-processing for nearly every shot I take. I try and do as minimal post-processing as possible. I do have, I usually spend no more than 5 or 10 minutes with a photo. Usually I just brighten up some shadows, provide some sharpening to the photograph, but I tend not to do much, and it's because one of my whole ideas of photography, especially insect and nature photography, is to show people what I saw in the field. So, and I usually mention a few things about ethics too in macro photography. I do not have time to do that today, but I always tell people I do not capture insects. I do not freeze them. I do not kill them. I try not to move them very much, if at all, when I'm in the field. Some photographers do a lot of that, and that's okay, especially for scientific purposes, for research purposes. That tends to be very normal. But I am of the opinion that the type of photography that I want to showcase are insects and spiders in their natural habitat. So when it comes to post-processing in Photoshop, I try and retain that same ideas. I'm not going to do too much that really renders the photograph that different than what it was I saw when I was in the field, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does, and I guess there's that would be it's interesting where that line starts and stops between where do you go too far, and I guess just full disclosure is important anytime you would edit a photo, but that's a really nice way to approach it, is that you want to keep it as natural as possible.
Yeah. Another reason why I love insect photography so much is as I've learned a lot about photography, as I've followed a lot of photographers on especially Facebook, I noticed that there's a lot of photographs that they're getting a tremendous amount of attention. These photographs are going viral, and they're composite images, or they're images that were very, very heavily edited. It happens a lot with insects and spiders. It also happens a lot with reptiles and amphibians, where people are going to pet stores, they're purchasing things, they're taking them out into their yard, taking a photo of them and saying, look what I found in nature. And it's not true, it's not real. I've seen photographs of jumping spiders on top of praying mantises with captions like, "Go forth, my noble steed." And people love this. And they're like, I had no idea that a jumping spider would get on top of a praying mantis. And you're like, it didn't. It's a composite image. Somebody photoshopped that. And it leads to a lot of misguidance in how we view insects and how we think of their behavior. And I like to keep things as natural as possible and show people what insects and spiders really do in the natural world.
Sure. Okay, great. Well, I'm not seeing any questions come in. So again, thanks for this. Most people, I'm not sure how people found out about, if you found out, if you saw this on learn.extension.org, once I'm done with the video processing, we'll post a link to the video there. And I don't know, do you have a YouTube, I guess you have a YouTube page or site, Danae, that you'll post this to?
I can post on my blog. We'll probably also post the video on our Ed Tech blog here at Ohio State, and maybe our YouTube channel as well. We can link it to. So
great. Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone.